We got water, Eustace!
No more sunshine!
Yeah!
I'm so thankful that this actually worked. I'm super grateful for Eustace and all of his help.
Eustace Conway's longtime cameraman has finally broken his silence. And what he revealed about life behind the scenes at Turtle Island is nothing like what viewers imagined. For years, his job was to follow Eustace through the wilderness, capturing the danger, the discipline, and the raw reality of mountain men. But the cameraman says there were moments the public never saw. Moments that shook him, changed him, and in one case, nearly cost him his life. He claims Eustace asked him to keep quiet for the sake of the land. But today, he's finally telling what really happened out there. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this shocking story. The cameraman says the very first thing he learned about working with Eustace Conway was that nothing about Turtle Island Preserve functioned the way outsiders assumed. He explains that viewers at home saw a calm, deliberate mountain man moving with purpose. But what the cameras never captured was how fast Eustace truly moved when no one else was around. According to him, Eustace didn't just walk the land, he flowed through it, cutting through thick brush with the ease of someone who knew every tree root by memory. The cameraman describes trying to follow him with nearly 30 pounds of gear strapped to his back, slipping on mud, sliding down slopes, and constantly fighting to keep Eustace in frame, because turning away for just a second meant losing him to the trees. He says Eustace would stop suddenly, lift a hand, and silence the entire crew with just a glance. And it wasn't for dramatic effect. The cameraman insists these pauses were tense, unsettling moments where the air itself felt heavy, the woods too quiet, and Eustace's expression suddenly serious. He remembers one moment clearly. Eustace froze in place, stared into a dense patch of forest, and whispered, "Don't move. Something's off." The cameraman thought Eustace was being cautious about wildlife, maybe a bear or a predator nearby. But when he asked later what Eustace sensed, Eustace refused to answer and simply said, "The land speaks. Sometimes it warns." The cameraman says that was the first time he realized Eustace wasn't just operating on outdoor skills. He had a connection to Turtle Island that defied explanation. As the days went on, he noticed Eustace reacting to subtle shifts in the wind, distant cracks of branches, or even the way birds suddenly went silent. The cameraman says these moments weren't included in the final episodes because they didn't fit the pacing of the show, but to him, they were the most telling moments of all. They hinted that Eustace carried knowledge, maybe even fear, of something deeper within the land, something he didn't want the world to know about. The cameraman says things became even more unsettling during the early morning shoots, when fog covered Turtle Island like a white curtain. He explains that Eustace insisted they start filming before sunrise because the land wakes up before the people do. But the crew quickly realized those hours carried a strange tension. He recalls one morning when they were hiking toward an old logging path. The fog was so thick he could barely see Eustace's outline ahead of him. Suddenly, Eustace stopped, crouched low, and motioned for the cameraman to cut the audio. Without a word, Eustace pointed to a set of tracks, huge, deep, and unlike anything the cameraman recognized. He says they looked like oversized elk prints, but too far apart and too heavy, as if whatever made them wasn't moving on four legs. When he whispered, asking what it was, Eustace only said, "We don't follow those," then turned sharply and took an entirely different route through the woods. The cameraman says the show never used that footage, not because it wasn't dramatic, but because Eustace personally asked them to delete it. That was the moment he understood Eustace wasn't just protecting his land. He was hiding parts of it. According to the cameraman, there were places Eustace refused to let them film, trails he blocked off, and signs carved into trees that he pretended not to notice. And every time the crew asked questions, Eustace shut them down with a quiet but stern warning. Some things out here aren't meant for TV. The cameraman says things took a darker turn when the crew tried to film a sequence deep near the back edge of Turtle Island, a place Eustace rarely visited on camera. He remembers Eustace hesitating before they entered the area, almost like he was debating whether to turn back. But production had a schedule, so he pressed on. As they walked in, the cameraman noticed something immediately different. The forest felt older, thicker, and strangely quiet, like all sound had been swallowed. Even their footsteps seemed muffled. He says Eustace kept glancing over his shoulder, not at the crew, but at something behind them, as if he knew they were being watched. At one point, the boom operator tapped the cameraman and pointed to a tree with long horizontal claw marks carved deeply into the bark. Eustace saw their reactions, stepped in front of the tree, and quietly told them, "Keep moving. Don't film this." But the cameraman admits he hit record anyway, long enough to capture a few seconds before Eustace gave him a look that froze him in place. He says that look wasn't anger. It was fear. A fear he had never seen on Eustace's face before. Minutes later, Eustace suddenly changed direction, leading them down a steep incline and pushing them to hurry. He didn't explain why. The cameraman says the crew was exhausted trying to keep up, stumbling and sliding as Eustace moved faster and faster. When they finally stopped, Eustace told them to take a break, but his eyes were fixed on the ridge behind them the entire time. The cameraman asked what was going on, and Eustace quietly said, "This part of the land doesn't want us here." After that day, Eustace refused to let production return to that side of Turtle Island, claiming it was unsafe for filming. But the cameraman believes the real reason had nothing to do with terrain, and everything to do with whatever left those marks on the trees. The cameraman says the moment everything changed came during a late afternoon shoot, when the crew was trying to capture Eustace rebuilding an old shelter deep inside Turtle Island. The sun was dropping fast, and they needed just a few more shots before losing daylight. He remembers Eustace working quietly, his axe striking clean and rhythmic, when suddenly the birds stopped chirping all at once. The cameraman didn't think much of it at first, until he noticed Eustace slowly lowering his axe, tilting his head slightly like he was listening to something only he could hear. The crew stood frozen, waiting for his cue, but Eustace didn't speak. Then, without warning, he whispered, "Pack up! Now!" The cameraman says there was no mistaking the urgency in his voice. They scrambled to shut down equipment, stuffing cords and batteries into half-closed cases, as Eustace kept glancing toward the tree line. The cameraman dared to look too, and that's when he saw movement. Something large, shifting between the shadows far back in the woods. He couldn't identify a shape, only the sense of size, like whatever was out there was bigger than any animal he had ever encountered on shoots. He raised his camera out of instinct, but Eustace stepped in front of him and said firmly, "Don't film. Don't give it attention." The cameraman says Eustace led the crew out with a pace that bordered on a run, forcing them through brush so thick their equipment caught on branches. Several times he stumbled and nearly fell, but Eustace didn't slow down. He kept pushing forward, constantly checking behind them like he knew something was following. By the time they reached a clearing, the sun had fallen completely, and the crew was winded and confused. The cameraman asked Eustace what he saw, what they were running from. But Eustace refused to answer. Instead, he said something that haunted the cameraman for years. "If you stay on this land long enough, you'll understand why some trails end suddenly." The cameraman says they wrapped early that day, and Eustace insisted no one walk back to their vehicles alone. When they returned the next morning, Eustace acted as though nothing unusual had happened, but he immediately redirected filming to another part of the preserve. And when the cameraman reviewed the audio recordings later, he discovered something more disturbing. The final minutes of their hike were filled with faint, distant sounds, almost like heavy breathing or low growls, too slow and too deep to be any normal animal. The audio technicians swore the sounds weren't there while they were walking. The cameraman still believes that whatever watched them that day was closer than any of them realized. The cameraman says that after that day, the crew started noticing a pattern. Every time something strange happened on Turtle Island, Eustace would react first, then quietly rewrite the plan for the entire shoot. One afternoon, they were scheduled to film a simple sequence of Eustace crossing a narrow footbridge over a rocky ravine. It was supposed to be an easy, scenic shot, the kind of thing that made the show beautiful. The cameraman went ahead to set up on the other side, carefully balancing himself and his gear on the uneven boards. As he adjusted focus, one of the planks beneath his boot suddenly snapped. He remembers the world tilting, the camera jerking, and then a violent lurch as his body dropped sideways off the bridge. He didn't have time to scream. He says the only reason he didn't crash all the way onto the rocks below was because something yanked him backward with terrifying force. When he looked up, dizzy and shaking, he saw Eustace on his stomach, one hand wrapped around the cameraman's harness, the other gripping the bridge so hard his knuckles were white. With the help of a second crew member, Eustace dragged him back onto the boards and barked at everyone to get off the bridge immediately. Once they were on solid ground, production wanted to check the footage, thinking they had just captured an incredibly dramatic moment for the show. But Eustace stepped in and shut it down. The cameraman remembers Eustace looking him directly in the eyes and saying, "You don't use that. You understand? The land gave you a warning. You don't turn that into entertainment." Later that evening, when the others were packing up, Eustace pulled him aside. He asked if the cameraman had ever felt like the land itself chose who stayed and who left. Still rattled, he laughed it off. But Eustace didn't smile. He just said, "You almost weren't meant to be here anymore." The cameraman says that after that, he started noticing quiet changes. Eustace walking ahead to test the ground before they followed, avoiding certain trails after heavy rain, even refusing to film near specific dead trees he called markers. When the network pushed for more dramatic stunts, Eustace pushed back harder, reminding them that the crew weren't actors, they were guests on a living piece of land that didn't forgive carelessness. The cameraman claims there were multiple near misses like that, falling branches that landed inches away, unstable ledges that crumbled right after they cleared them, and sudden storms that rolled in only over Turtle Island while nearby towns remained clear. None of it ever made it into the show. According to him, it wasn't because the footage wasn't good enough. It was because Eustace believed some moments were warnings, and filming those warnings without respect would only invite worse. That was when the cameraman began to realize that the most dangerous thing about Turtle Island wasn't the wildlife, the cold, or the isolation. It was the feeling that someone, or something, was always watching the people who dared to point cameras at it. The cameraman says the breaking point came during a nighttime shoot the network insisted on, hoping to capture authentic wilderness after dark. Eustace didn't like the idea from the start. He told them plain and simple, "The forest has rules at night. We don't break them." But production pushed. arguing it would make great television. Reluctantly, Eustace agreed to 1 hour, no more. As soon as the sun slipped behind the ridge, the temperature dropped sharply. The cameraman says the moment daylight faded, the woods changed in a way he could feel in his chest. The air grew heavy, the silence thick and unnatural, as if every living thing had retreated. They followed Eustace down a narrow path with only headlamps cutting through the darkness. The cameraman recalls hearing faint snaps of branches far off in the shadows, but every time he pointed his camera in that direction, nothing appeared. Eustace kept signaling them to stay close, repeating under his breath, "Don't wander. Don't look too long into the dark." About half an hour in, they reached a small clearing. The crew began setting up lights, but Eustace suddenly stepped between them and the tree line, staring into the blackness as though he saw something they didn't. The cameraman turned his lens toward the same spot. At first, he saw nothing, just dense, motionless woods. Then, for a split second, he caught a faint glimmer of eyes reflecting the light, far too high off the ground to belong to any known animal. Before he could zoom in, Eustace slammed his hand over the lens and whispered sharply, "Don't. Not here." The cameraman says Eustace's voice carried a fear he had never heard before. Moments later, a deep, resonant sound rolled through the clearing, a low, vibrating hum that didn't match any creature the crew recognized. Every hair on the cameraman's arms stood on end. Eustace immediately grabbed the nearest light, switched it off, and ordered everyone to pack up. The crew hesitated, thinking it was just an animal encounter, but Eustace raised his voice, saying, "Move! Now!" As they hurried down the trail, the cameraman swears he heard something large, pacing them from the trees, never fully visible but always just close enough to break branches in measured, deliberate steps. When they finally reached the vehicles, the entire crew piled in without a word. Eustace waited until everyone was accounted for, then said quietly, "This land shows itself how it wants. We don't force it, and we don't film the night again." The cameraman says that was the last nighttime shoot the network ever requested. And from that point on, he realized Eustace wasn't just protecting the land. He was protecting the crew from something they weren't prepared to understand. The cameraman says the final incident that convinced him Eustace was keeping far more secrets than the show ever revealed happened during what was supposed to be a simple interview day. The crew set up near a quiet section of Turtle Island, with a stream running behind them, a calm, open spot Eustace usually preferred when speaking on camera. Everything was going smoothly at first. Eustace talked about self-reliance, the changing seasons, and the responsibility of living close to the land. But midway through a sentence, he stopped talking and stared past the crew, his expression shifting from calm to deeply unsettled. The cameraman followed his gaze, but saw only the forest swaying gently in the breeze. Eustace stepped off the wooden stool they had him sitting on and walked several feet toward the tree line, squinting as if trying to confirm something. The sound operator whispered, asking if they should cut, but Eustace lifted a hand. Quiet, controlled, but tense. Then the woods went silent. The stream kept running, but the birds vanished. The insects muted themselves, and even the wind seemed to stall. The cameraman says the silence was so sudden and so complete, it felt unnatural, like someone had muted the world. Eustace took another step toward the trees, then turned and ordered the crew to move the equipment back, slowly and without turning their backs to the forest. The cameraman admits he didn't understand why, but the seriousness in Eustace's voice made him obey. As they backed away, he caught movement at the edge of his peripheral vision. a shape slipping behind a cluster of pines, too tall to be a deer and too steady to be a falling branch. When he tried to refocus the camera, Eustace grabbed the barrel of the lens and forced it downward. He whispered, "If you point that at it, it won't stay in the trees." The crew retreated with their gear, and only once they were a good distance away did Eustace allow them to take a breath. He told production they were done for the day. No more interviews, no more filming, no exceptions. They argued at first, but Eustace was unshakable. He said, "Some things on this land don't like attention. They don't like lenses. They don't like being named." After the crew left, the cameraman stayed behind a moment longer, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. That night, he reviewed the final seconds of recorded footage. There, behind Eustace's shoulder, barely visible through the trees, was a thin, vertical silhouette, a shape that didn't match any animal native to the region. When he showed it to Eustace the next morning, Eustace immediately deleted the file, looked him in the eye, and said, "If you want to keep filming with me, you leave that alone." The cameraman never saw that figure again, but he says the message was clear. Turtle Island held things that were never meant to be shown, and Eustace was determined to keep it that way. The cameraman says the reason he's finally speaking out now is because years after leaving the show, the weight of what he witnessed on Turtle Island never fully left him. He explains that most people assume the scariest part of filming mountain men was the wilderness itself, the storms, the wild animals, the isolation, but he insists that wasn't it. What stayed with him were the moments when Eustace reacted to things no one else could hear, see, or understand. He recalls nights when Eustace would sit by the fire, long after the crew had gone to bed, staring into the woods with a guarded expression, as if keeping watch over something that could cross into camp at any moment. He remembers days when Eustace would abruptly end filming because the land didn't feel right, even if the weather was perfect and the schedule was tight. And he remembers the way Eustace always walked the perimeter before allowing the crew to settle in, circling slowly, tapping certain trees, muttering under his breath like he was acknowledging something unseen. The cameraman says he tried to convince himself that Eustace was simply an expert woodsman with sharp instincts, but after everything he experienced, the tracks too large to explain, the nighttime eyes too high off the ground, the unnatural silences, the hum in the clearing, the figure in the trees, he can't accept the simple explanation anymore. According to him, Eustace wasn't just protecting a preserve, he was guarding a boundary, a thin line between the world people think they understand and something older, deeper, and far more aware, something he believes Eustace has known about his entire life. The cameraman says he is finally speaking out because he feels people should understand that what they saw on TV was only a fraction of what Turtle Island really holds. Not to expose Eustace, but to explain why he respects the man more than ever. He believes Eustace kept them safe not through luck, but through knowledge. Knowledge passed down, learned through years of living with the land instead of on it. He ends by saying that he doesn't blame Eustace for hiding the truth. Some truths aren't meant for the world. Some places aren't meant to be mapped or recorded. And some stories, no matter how unbelievable, leave a mark too deep to ignore. Before ending his statement, he gave one final warning. If you ever visit Turtle Island, don't wander off the path. Don't follow anything that looks back at you. And if the woods go silent, leave. The cameraman says people may doubt him, argue, or call his story exaggerated, but he doesn't care. He knows what he saw, what he heard, and what followed them through those trees. And as he puts it, if Eustace hadn't been there, I don't think any of us would have made it out the same.